Thank you, and thanks everyone for coming tonight. This is our fourth wing lecture, and I'm really delighted to see everyone here and online as well. So in my 20-odd years at the Newberry, I've come to realize that there are two things that everybody loves equally, wood type and David Shields. And so I have thoughtfully brought those two things together in one program for you tonight. If you don't know him, David Shields earned a BFA in graphic design from Memphis State University and an MFA from Cranbrook Academy of Art. He is currently associate professor and up until 2021, chair of the Department of Graphic Design at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond. There's nothing so delightful as the phrase former chair, I'm sure. He was formerly associate professor of design at the University of Texas at Austin and the design custodian of the Rob Roy Kelly American Wood Type Collection. David has spent his career researching, speaking, and writing about wood type. And in 2022, he published the Rob Roy Kelly American Wood Type Collection, a history and catalog, which I would call the definitive book on American wood type. Most of us only experience wood type in print. We see it on posters, we see it in type specimens. But David thinks about wood type in this way, but he also thinks deeply about wood type in its material form, how it was manufactured, distributed, and used, and then later described and collected. In doing so, he reveals much not just about the history of printing in America, but about the history of printing in America. So without further ado, I will turn the program over to our speaker tonight, David Shields.
Oh, it is on. Can you hear me okay? I will stand this close to the microphone all evening. Hi, howdy, hello. Thank you so much to Jill and to Alicia and to Liv for the hospitality and bringing me in. Super amazing. Thank you, Newberry, for making the space. This is sort of really high on the food chain for me. I'm a little nervous about speaking at the Newberry, so I'll try to not make up as much stuff as I normally do. Also, Paul Gale is here in the crowd, so I can't really make up too much. But also thank you to Paul for all the support over my time as a researcher and my time coming to the Newberry. It's each time there's new stuff here, so it gives me a good sense that I'll just keep coming back. Oh, pointer, yes, here we go. All right, so tonight's lecture is about wood type as the realia of type, and I have to give a shout out to teaching the word realia to. I learned the word realia through my friendship with Amelia Fontenelle, who is a curator at RIT at the Carey Collection. And it's just always struck me as this really like, oh, it's this real thing. There's a historical document, we don't call that realia, but we do call like type and stuff, objects, real. So this is the book. I think it might be in the bookstore. I don't know. I didn't bring any with me, but there's this. And mostly with that, I'll talk a little bit. We'll get to the realia in a second, but first I'll sort of provide you the historical context for this quickly, then talk a little bit about Rob Roy Kelly, who did a large amount of collecting in the mid-20th century. No relationship to the exhibit that's here this evening. I haven't quite parsed that yet, but I'll work on it. So wood type was certainly has a long history of being used in printing. Going back, the Chinese were using it early on in their sort of duplication and replication of letters. But in the United States, it was sort of industrialized in the beginning of the 19th century. So 1827 certainly has its kind of height of importance after the American Civil War, right up until kind of the end of the 19th century. The electric sign, the Flatiron Building and skyscrapers and neon signs all sort of kind of happen right at the end when wood type is sort of falling off. This is the guy that invented the tool that allowed for the industrial production of wood type. You can actually go to any hardware store and they have an aisle for it. I would recommend not going to a hardware store and saying, where is your wood type tools aisle? Because they get very confused and it's like, no, the router was invented to make printing type. Everybody knows that. Darius Wells invented the tool that spun a steel blade that allowed for the efficient cutting away of material. He didn't patent it, and now you can go to the hardware store and buy a router. This is pretty much what the 19th century looked like because of wood type. These are younger men in New York in the mid-1900s. Their actual size to the type, so you see really big type, and that's what wood type provided, was making really big stuff on, putting it on presses that could print really big posters and then post it up around the city. You can see a lot of the, not this material, but you can see lots of collected material in libraries like this that have 19th century collections. But it's also a 20th century phenomenon. Even though the industry was falling off at the end of the 19th century, there was still a use for large letters on large placards. So here, anti-war message right around the First World War. And then also still into the mid-20th century, this was printed with wood type. So important for cultural history as well. This is a guy that sort of wrote the history that saved a lot of this material. Rob Roy Kelly started collecting wood type in the mid-1950s, simply as a way, as a tool for his students to use in the graphic design program that he had started in Minneapolis. As a sort of a tool for building figure-ground relationships. And they started asking questions, and he couldn't answer them, so he said, I'll just go find the book, and we'll get the answers. And then he realized there wasn't a book there, so he started doing the research. I think of Kelly first and foremost as a wood type collector, but in fact, he's a really important sort of person in graphic design history, certainly American graphic design history. He started from scratch 3 important programs in the country. The first graphic design program, Yale started theirs in the mid-1950s as a graduate program. The first undergraduate program was started by Rob Roy Kelly in 1955. He moved on to the Kansas City Art Institute in '64 and then eventually made his way to Arizona and started a third program in 1983. Yep, 1983, right? But this was the first document that he wrote. As he was beginning to collect material for his students and try to figure out answers, he started making trips to libraries or reaching out to librarians and archivists to ask questions about what is this stuff. Most people, there's multiple sort of archives that have his material, and a lot of it was just rejection letters, like, we don't really know what you're talking about. Like, you should check something in agriculture. But luckily, he made a connection to Roland Bonham at Columbia University, and that connection led to a connection here to the Newberry to James Wells. And here's a letter where Kelly strikes up a conversation or correspondence with Wells talking about the material, and then sent Mr. Wells a copy of his first publication. This is from the collection here at the Newberry. But in it, he also, Wells connects Kelly further to more people and building a larger network. So Rory McLean and Phyllis Handover and Nicolette Gray, although he ruins Nicolette Gray's name, whatever. I'm sure it got fixed before the TypeScript got sent out. But sort of expanding Kelly's network. And the real critical work to the collection was how he began formulating a historical response to the material and putting it into a context. And that couldn't have been done without these interpersonal relationships that he was sort of afforded by his connections to librarians and archivists. So big shout out to archivists and librarians. So his second publication, sort of shortly after the Walker publication in '63, he produced a document in 1964 that was a printed specimen of all of the type in his collection, and a small writing that was adapted from the Walker publication, and a catalog of what was in the collection at the time, which is a fairly important document. Was to me when I started taking care of the collection in 2004 in Texas, because it is a study collection there. But we'll get to that in a second. Um, I meant to warn you, I have a few digressions. Sorry, they'll just take a second. One is I mentioned this particular document in a public way because I've had very good luck mentioning this particular document in a public way in the past. So Kelly produced 45 volumes of his folio. 35 were sold through Herman Cohen's bookshop in New York, and the other 10 Kelly distributed on his own. I've tracked down 27 of them in known collections. I'm still missing 18, so if you know of one, not the one here, I've already got it on. If you know of one, if you have, you suspect one where one might be, let me know. I have done this before, and people actually take me up on it, and two of the documents on this list were actually found this way. So digression and hopeful shout out. So after the folio, Kelly then produces this book, which is sort of what we think of as the fundamental foundational text for American wood type, the historicizing of the whole period, and looking at job printing in general in American, as it produced American visual culture in the 19th century. Then it was reprinted in '77, and then Kelly did his real work. He stopped dealing with wood type in the '70s, but he, at that point, was a collector of a lot of things. And he started collecting kitchen utensils, specifically kitchen trivets and stands, which are cast iron devices that you set on your countertop so your countertop doesn't get harmed by hot things, right? Pretty super, pretty easy. What I find fascinating, and you should check out this book if you have a chance, he worked out all the kinks in the book about wood type. Like the wood type was in some ways a prototype for this. Very much approaches this visually, typographically, how they were produced, who the manufacturers were. The bulk of this collection, there's a collection in Vermont that housed a big portion of the collection. His personal collection is now in Arizona at the Arizona Historical Museum. So if you're into kitchen trivets, this is really Kelly's real work. Anyway, we'll move on. The last piece that he wrote about wood type, he was invited by the folks at Adobe. They were working on digitizing wood type, and so they asked him to help curate the types that were in that collection and write about them. And so this was really kind of his last formal work in the field. Kelly sells the collection in '66. And the way he talks about it is it was spurred, the sale was spurred on by a move from Minnesota to Kansas when he changed jobs. He had to move all this material, and he realized he couldn't really take care of it anymore. So he started trying to find a new home for it, knowing that he wasn't going to be able to take care of it. But in correspondence here at the Newberry, you realize he was actually looking much earlier for a home for the material. This is from February of 1962, where he writes James Wells and says, I've got this collection. I would really love to not have students using it anymore. It would be great at an archive like yours. Wells turned him down, right? And for good reason. It's big and it's bulky, and it's dirty. So he sells the collection to, he has a personal acquaintance with Dr. Karpel, who was the head librarian at the Museum of Modern Art. They had met in Minnesota in the late 50s. Karpel sort of bridges the gap between, he buys the collection from Kelly for $5,000, and then he sells the collection to the University of Texas at Austin for $10,000. and it is still there today. The HRC, the Harry Ransom Center, was the holder of the collection right up until the early 90s, and then it was moved over to the design program where it remains a study collection. And here it is. There's a picture of students working in the collection. While Kelly, in his letter to Wells, was sort of disparaging of students using the type, we all know students as sort of a phrase that he used, but in fact he used it as a study collection to some degree for his students, and he knew very well that it was going to be a study collection by the time it came to Texas. So it was, in fact, something that he knew was going to happen and supported it. It has remained something that students can put their hands on because of these people. These are folks who at different times at UT helped save the collection. Henry Smith is the current curator and doing an amazing job. So if you ever get a chance to be in Austin, call Henry, see the collection. It's really great. They're doing good stuff. But this is basically what it looks like. To some degree, this was the work that I did while I was taking care of it. Most of that was making it up as I went along because I was not trained as a curator or an archivist, but I was trying to figure out how to make the collection more legible to students as they began using it, and also provided through that legibility as a way to help control what was going on with the collection. So students were able to engage it, but in mindful, sort of thoughtful ways. This is the oldest type in the collection. It was made in about 1850, and it is in fact something that students can use, right? It is a tool, so you use it or lose it, and it being used regularly has, I think, elongated the life of this particular collection of material. All sorts of different physical things in the collection that students get to use. Here's a student using it right there. And there's also sort of all the mishmash material. One of the things that kind of grew up, the myth around Kelly and his collecting that grew up around the book, and he didn't really ever disabuse people of the idea, but that his collections were interesting and amazing because they were complete and full sets of type. And that he was able to sort of really kind of build a cross-section of visual material from the 19th century. All of which is not untrue, but there's all the stuff that didn't kind of fit into that narrative, all the bits and pieces. So there's at least 2 hell boxes at the University of Texas. There's also really great material at the Carey collection in RIT. Kelly's second wife, after he passed away, donated all of those materials to Rochester. So it's a collection divided, and some of the work that I was trying to do with the book was tie these things back together and sort of make it at least sort of connected virtually. So again, with the book, right, I'm contractually obligated to show you, right? His book was brown, and he used one typeface, and so, you know, what are you gonna do? I didn't make it brown, and I did not use one typeface. So there's that. Also, the press likes me to mention that it is 408 pages, it's 7 pounds. That equals 58 cents an ounce or 15 cents a page. Just, it's a little shout out there, right? But back to the book. So the book started as a website when I began cataloging the work with students in the collection to really clarify what was in and what was not in the collection, how full things were, and what was the material that actually made it up. The book sort of came after the fact, but I think for good reasons. It ended up I had a much better grasp on the material by the time this got produced, and it is a series of I'll sort of talk about this in a second. I think of the book now as kind of a series of tools for other people to engage with their collections. But it is also a history. It talks about each of the sort of typefaces, but it also talks about and shows the material that's there. So in things like this chromatic face, it's a 2-color, or it's a set of blocks that are used in such a way as to present multicolored make multicolor printings that sort of mimicked color lithography using wood type. And there are things about, these are 2 different parts of the design But through certain visual artifacts, you can sort of see a trace outline at the top of this is a letter Q. You can see bits and pieces. You can also see the router. There's the pattern that's created there is from the spinning bit of metal that moved the wood away. So the imperfections of the industrial process give us a lot of information about how the thing was produced in sort of marked detail. And this particular set sort of shows that, in fact, the way it's, if you're a printer at all, putting blocks of type on a press at different times is horrible for registration. And if you want to keep them in register, if you want to make sure that they sort of work together, you have to be very precise about it. This is a particular face that was designed by the William Page Company, and they had worked out a method where they would cut an amalgamation of both designs on every block that they needed, and then some of those blocks they would cut away part of the letter, and on other blocks they would cut away the other part of the letter, so that they were in register. A little nerdery there. And here's another spread. There's 2 chromatic faces in the collection. Kelly only used 1 color in his book. I used 4. And so he wasn't able to necessarily show the 2 chromatic pieces that were in the collection, and didn't really talk about them in the text much. But there's actually 2 there. This one incomplete, you can see the Q and the Z are missing. But being able to look closely at this particular set was cut in the late 1850s. The other set that I just showed you was cut in the mid-1870s. And the sort of conceptual and technical approach that was brought was wildly different, to the point where the precision that was able to be brought, because they figured out how to sort of build these things in registration, was not happening earlier. And we can sort of see the sort of mismatch where the white is, the paper is showing through. It means a place where it's not registering. And that was because they were cutting these at different times with no relationship to each other. And again, you would need the blocks to see that. Without the blocks, we can't really tell that that was the production method. This would have been cut with a router and then finished by hand. And also seeing other details in the collection. There's all sorts of, a shop that's already ordered the type may need an extra character. And so rather than ordering a new piece of type, they would just flip the piece of type over and carve a new piece. And so something like this, these are antique forms, slab serif, sort of big chunky letters, that were carved on the back of another set of antiques, big slab serifs. They needed an extra M, they needed an extra C, and they needed a 7 for whatever they were printing. And this was fairly a common practice because the material was type high, so it would fit on a press bed and hit the rollers properly and print properly. So simply by turning it over allowed you the opportunity to kind of reuse that material in a way. So it is a collection that's used by students. And I wanted to very much kind of show the fact that it is a study collection and it's a tool. Tools get dinged up and you fix them and move on. So here's a broken piece of type that was a bit of a, when I was talking to the press, they were a little like, do you really want to show broken type? Like, you're supposed to be taking care of this stuff. What do you really want to? It's like, well, I'm not taking care of it anymore. But it's just made of wood, right? And you put it on a metal press, stuff's going to happen. And so trying to show that in the book also as a way to kind of show this as a real collection. It's not an abstraction. It is not complete and it is not perfect, which I think is all the better for it. It makes it all the more interesting. And then also just the things you find in the blocks. Here is a piece of type that on the back has an imprint, and on further inspection realize that it is silver dollar. We can make out the 1879 stamp. Now, oddly, this doesn't really help us date the piece. This particular type, because of other details that I'll talk about in a second, we can date to being produced between 1867 and 1876. The coin is from 1879. So it's not really necessarily historically interesting. This could have been done, I could have done it for the photo shoot had I had access to an 1879 silver dollar. But the fact that this shows humans making mistakes and using this material in weird ways to get things done, all of those traces are left on the physical material. The wood is a great recording device, and so all of these mishaps are recorded and they stick with the material. And so they continue being a place that students and scholars can investigate and interrogate because it remains there. Another part of Kelly's collecting, I've heard this from other collectors, how much they sort of venerate Kelly in a certain way, like, oh, he collected these complete sets, it was amazing, and all the type that he had gathered together, it's all there in the book. But in fact, the book isn't all showing his type from his collection. There are certain pieces that he borrowed from other collections. So in the book, to sort of show that point, rather than showing blocks of type, I show sort of reproductions of the material to kind of point to where this material is. He got some from Yale. He got some from RIT. This one is from an unnamed collection. I'm not quite sure where it is. There's another collection that was at the New York Public Library that is now at SUNY Purchase. And so these collections are out there. And they're important collections, but no more and no less important than Kelly's. Kelly's is important because he wrote about it and because he gathered it together, and it's still a study collection. But there are other larger collections as well, and he tapped into that network as well when he was producing the book to show a range of visual material. Here we are again with I bring this back because I showed you this before, right? And there's actually a clue that was printed in 1967, and nobody caught it. I looked at this book cover for years. And then seeing the film negatives that are held at the Harry Ransom Center, it's still like, this gives us a sense of an earlier version of the type. But in fact, if you look at the Y, it's a smaller size. Now, not a big deal. Wood type can kind of change size. It can shrink. It's an organic material. So I never thought much about it. And then finding sales receipts at the set of materials at the Harry Ransom Center in Texas, realizing, in fact, he was commissioning people to recut type to expand his collection. Now, he didn't really tell anybody that. So when people say, like, wow, it was amazing that he was able to collect all these things, not really. I mean, he did not, but there were holes, there were parts missing. And in his correspondence with another designer, he talks about how he worked with a place in Chicago to begin engraving new wood type. And it took a while for them to get in the spirit of the adventure so that they actually got it to be the right size to match the type that he needed. So that Y is an early version. Now, I don't have a photograph, and I am sorry, but this type is actually smaller, and there are certain pieces in the collection that look brand new. And when I was taking care of the collection, I sort of bought into like, oh, Kelly was an amazing collector and he brought all this stuff together and this is all historical. So I would just tell students and visitors and anybody that would listen, like, oh yeah, this one just never got printed. It's so clean because that. But in fact, it's so clean because it was only created in the early 1960s rather than sometime in the 19th century. Things staring us in the face, hiding in plain sight, but also we can only get to because of physical collection. This little bit wouldn't necessarily have made the kind of sense had we just looked at historical documents. So having the type there to see that in fact this Y is on a different sized body, made with a material that seems a lot cleaner than the rest of the pieces in the collection, begin to give us that information. Like I said before, I think of this book now as a series of tools for other people to use. And so one is kind of showing those tools so that other people can use them. And one is identifying type. Now, it is, or identifying the manufacturer of a type. And so a piece of type is formerly just a tree. And a tree got cut down and cut in a particular way and cured over a particular amount of time so it would stabilize, and then sort of cut down a little bit more so that it would fit on a printing press. And all of those moments of cutting are made with saws and devices. And all of those saws and devices leave traces of their making, traces of their cutting. And so when we look at this, this is a print of the foot of the block. We can see the blue sort of set of circles. It's sort of called out by the blue. That is the organic material, right? Trees, tree rings. But the other set of concentric patterns is the planing pattern, the saw that cut away. And so beginning to print all of I worked with students to print all the faces, and then a few summers later, hey, guess what we're gonna do? We're gonna flip them all over. I'm like, what? And we're going to print everything to see the print, to see what's going on with the cutting print. And that allowed for a way to identify particular manufacturers to particular patterns because of particular tools. The planing tools that were used in the 19th century were all custom made. The company would sort of call a machinist in, and they would put together the tool for them to use. And it wasn't really until the 20th century that those things became fully standardized. And so these tools sort of leave a trace. Now I know what you're thinking. You're looking at this and going like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. The page pattern is the same as the Cooley pattern. What gives, man? So I thought the same thing when I was trying to like, ooh, this is amazing. This is like scholarship I can use to get tenure. It's really good. And then I hit this and I was like, oh, nope, never mind. Oh well. But then I found the correspondence that William Page wrote to James Hamilton at the end of the 19th century. And he talks about how he bought J.G. Cooley out because Cooley just stole all of his stuff anyway. And so they were getting that off the market. And Cooley had a really great planing tool that they could use to cut wood type, and it was much better than theirs. And so if you look at the dates that are tuned to a set of stamps, Cooley's is earlier, and then that same tool travels to Page's shop and is being used for the same effect. So the reason it's the same is because it's the same tool. So there. Another tool is beginning to identify the manufacturers. And so the manufacturers would tend to stamp their name on the side of a block, capital A in the US, so that you knew who made it, and then more importantly, who to reorder from. So using that and then seeing all the variety of manufacturing stamps that we've found so far, being able to then look at and define particular periods when those stamps were used, mostly through changes in company names. So when a company changed its corporate name, they would then change the stamp. And that gives us a sense we can check the corporate records and see when that happened. And so it tends to follow one from the other. And so it's a way to begin to sort of clarify. Another digression. I wrote an article that got published in American Printing History Association's journal where I sort of talk about all of these stamps, but I also sort of put forward the possibility of maybe using big bibliographic tools as a way to transcribe the stamps so that we're better able to kind of describe what's on a piece of type so that hopefully collectors can begin using this tool as a way to identify what they have and more clearly communicate with each other, and we'll find more stuff. My hope is there are a lot more things to find that are sort of holes in the historic record to date. Working with students is work in close reading, and so the students that I worked with to print all of the type, we spent a lot of time looking at the characters and looking at sort of what was going on with the block, and they printed this particular set one day. And what we were doing is unpacking everything and printing all of the characters. And they sort of came back the next day and they were like, there's something going on here. Is it just that there's such variety in the type shapes that, what gives? And so we can't see it here, but again, hiding in plain sight, this is a page from Kelly's, that's for me to talk quicker. I'll talk quicker. This is a page from Kelly's book, published in '69. And what we did is in printing all the characters, we then overlaid all of the characters on each other and sort of teased out that there were two sort of basic patterns that were going on. And this is a set sort of slightly colored, to unpack that particular set of type and realize there's two designs, two interpretations of a design packed away in that set. So it was a way of sort of extending the collection and sort of working with students and sort of looking closely at that material. I suspect if more people did this with their collections, we would find more type in existing type drawers. So in the last moments, I also do other stuff, or actually I just do more of this stuff. And a lot of the groundwork of the work I'm working on now sort of grew out of the Kelly book. One is to build an annotated bibliography of all of the specimen catalogs produced in the 19th and 20th century. Collections like here at the Newberry are critical to that work because they, can I say you're the second best? It's an amazing collection that just crushes everyone else's collection of printed material. So go visit and look at the type specimen catalogs that are here at this collection. We can edit that other part. Yeah, good, great. That won't be, it'll not show up in the Zoom. So this is important to sort of chart, understand who was producing and who was selling material when and from where. Part of that is then looking for who has already started digitizing this material. I've been working with some folks that are connected to the Letterform archive out on the West Coast. They've started a running list of all the digitized catalogs. I'm just adding the wood type stuff. But it becomes a really great resource for people that can't make it to Chicago and see the collection that's here. And so there's a growing registry of information that's available. Also, beginning to index all of those specimen catalogs. So we know the catalogs exist. We know where they are to some degree, most of the major collections. And then by looking carefully page to page, I'm working with students to index all of the letter forms that are present so that we can build a larger database of what exists physically and then what maybe is lost to time and only is available through the specimen record. And then also looking at, I don't have enough time in the day. I also look at, or I'm finishing up cataloging all of the type and letter form patents in the US Patent Registry from the 19th and into the 20th century. So working on that. And then I think most importantly for me is this is a human activity. Human beings made type. They designed type, and then they cut type, and then they printed the type, right? It's a basic human need. And I've become fascinated with trying to figure out who those people were. Because the 19th century is mostly ignored, mostly all of that sort of visual material is typically seen as just kind of happening, and it's just part of the culture, and who knows who did it, some worker bees. But I'm really interested in those worker bees and who they were and where they were. So the places, it's hard to track people down in the 19th century, but this is an example of William Page's group of employees, and here they are sort of more organized by their role at the company. He stayed in one place for the entire length of his sort of tenure as a wood type maker. He got out of the business, he sold his collection to James Hamilton that moved out to Wisconsin, just the other side of the lake, and right? Yes, no, Michigan, and then anyway, I'm bad at geography. It's near water. So Page stayed in one place, and that one place did a good job of building registries of folks that were living in that town. This being Norwich, Connecticut. You can look through the annual directories of everybody that was living in the town. They give their occupation and who they were working for and their address. And so beginning to build that list of human beings that were making this work. And also, it's sort of called out here a little bit. Kind of the amazing thing about Page also was the number of female workers that he hired. starting during the Civil War, so in the 1860s, and then running all the way through his time as a company, he was employing them working as type cutters. Now, I haven't done enough work in sort of labor history of the 19th century, but a quarter of your employees seems like an interesting number that maybe we need to dig into more. So shout out to economists and labor historians, like maybe this is something to look at. But it's interesting to see that human beings were making this work. They made choices with their hands and tools that we now have because we've kept this material and we have access to it. Okay, I do some stuff on the internet very slowly. I do some things more quickly on Instagram. But really, all of it is made possible because of folks like you and places like this. Citations are just a way of saying thank you, right? Like sort of the larger way. The reason we cite work is to say thank you for letting us use it. And my work would absolutely not be possible without all these folks that have been so generous with their time and answering really pesky questions that I ask, or staying open sometimes past hours just so I can like do things. I've been super lucky. And so these people are responsible for it. A little star by the Newberry. And luckily both those people are in this. I never get to do that. They're never also in the audience. So that's awesome. And then besides that, I'm a designer. I like type, I use type. And so these are all the typefaces that I used in this particular presentation. I used about this many in the book. I also teach type at school, so it's difficult to sort of negotiate that with students. Like, well, you really don't need to use 20 faces, but you did. Like, yeah, nah, whatever, don't listen to me. Shout out to Jackson Kavanaugh, who's also here. This is like a trifecta. Like 3 people on my list that I got to thank are actually here. That never happens. But anyway, thank you so very much.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. That was fascinating. I have questions, but other people have questions, and we got some very specific and some general, but I think one that some people might want to know is what type of wood was used for wood type?
Oh, that's great. Several different kinds. In the beginning of the 19th century, when it was first being made, really just Turkish boxwood. That was pretty much what was picked up from wood engravers that were working at the same time. And up until sort of the 1840s, 1850s, when there was kind of an economic embargo with Europe. Again, I'm not an economic historian, so please forgive me for that gross overgeneralization. Something happened with the economy, and we stopped importing Turkish wood type. Turkish boxwood, and so there were other types, Hollywood, fruit trees, cherry, and pear are often sometimes used, but really in this country it's maple, sugar maple, because it's a hard, dense-grained wood, easily available. For a while on the East Coast, and then as that got sort of scooped up, sort of further west. So the reason a manufacturer moved to Wisconsin was because that's where all the maple was at that point. So there's that. Europeans tend to still use pear. Americans tend to use sugar maple.
Just as a follow-up to that, what's the lifespan of that? Like, how many impressions could they do? Because I know when people talk about woodblock printing, they talk about blocks breaking or wearing down. So how does that work with type?
I think it's just how it's been used. Certainly, the reason wood type was produced, one was to make stuff big, but it was also so that you could print a lot of things. So flour sacks, burlap bags that have printing, wood type was used to do that. And it was torturous on the wood type. So almost none of that material, if you were printing bags of flour in the 19th century, almost none of that material was left because it would just eat up your type. If you're printing on paper, much less of an impact. And certainly there's things in the collection in Texas that are very old and they're used by students, and so it stays working. But it's also, wood is really pretty easy to repair. So it's, as long as the face hasn't been marred in a particularly disfiguring way, it's pretty easy to work with the blocks.
And then, so there was a question about the router, and so were there parts of it that had to be done by hand? I mean, if you,
Yes.
so what were the limitations? How did that work?
Great question. So a router is really just kind of a glorified drill, right? It's just a tool that spins a piece of metal really fast to cut away that material. So because it spins in a circle, it spins around, it leaves a circular mark. And so the acute angles on a piece of type, where the crossbar matches the downstroke, is not built to have a circular, unless it was designed specifically to have a circular edge. You need to figure out how to make that a sharp angle. And so you would do it by hand. And there's any number of tools that were used directly from wood engravers were sort of the people that kind of filled that. And certainly metalsmiths and goldsmiths who were using tools like that. Metal typography was cut steel on steel to make punches. And so that technology was readily available, and that's what was used to sort of hand finish all of that material.
So it feels like we're just having a conversation. It's a little weird. These are actually questions asked by other people, not just me. So, we often think of wood type as being big, but there's lots of smaller things too. They're very decorative, like my beloved log font or leaf font. So someone asked, what's the smallest wood type manufactured?
2-line, which means I'm bad at math. Somebody's good at math in this audience. 24 point type is pretty much the smallest wood type that was commercially made. And oddly, sort of, it became available pretty early on in the industry. So by the 1850s, 1860s, they were able to cut 24 point type, which is 72 points to the inch. So half. Again, I bet we'll fix this in post, right? I'll have a thoroughly mathematical answer to that.
And were those decorative? So what were those like, or what's the reason for doing like a small, like a wood type that size?
I don't know how to answer that question. There's certain people that collect specifically small wood type because it's perplexing. Like, why in the world you weren't saving that much money by buying small wood type when you could buy the same sized metal type? So it's a curiosity. Now, as an aside, much smaller wood type was actually cut by the William Page Company for the American Exposition. He built 2 giant plaques built of actual wood type. One of those is at the Smithsonian, and it's amazing to see. But there's type that's even smaller than that was cut with a router to basically show off. He was being a showboat and showing what they could do with the material. And that is in that plaque. It wouldn't have ever been useful for printing. It would have broken really easily, but it exists.
I'm just not going to believe that William Page was a show-off. That's an
I don't
insight.
have a
That's an
photo of
inside
him.
joke.
His beard, it's...
So somebody else had a question about the manufacturer stamps. Are there any stamps like metal stamps? What were they stamping with?
They were stamping with steel. I have yet to find any. There is one example of a broken one at the Hamilton Museum, but it was used specifically for the furniture, so the type cases. It matches a configuration that's used readily there. I don't know why we can't find those. There was more than one. They weren't throwing them out because it was an expensive material. It was not a cheap thing to produce. So I don't know why. Maybe talks like this will help rattle the cage and people will find them.
So this is an eagle-eyed viewer. I said the negative of the dust jacket of Kelly's book says types, plural. The printer jacket says type. The S has been eliminated. Any story there?
excellent eagle-eye viewer. He just changed the film negatives that I showed you of the letter was an earlier version of the book. The book was originally supposed to be published in about 1964, and then it slipped to about 1965, and then it slipped to 1967, and then 68. And then finally it was produced in 1969. And I don't know, there's some correspondence, and part of it is, Kelly got busy, but also the publishing house that originally contracted with him to produce the work got bought out twice in that short amount of time. And so I think there was just sort of internal maneuverings that were done. Again, labor historians or historians of economic history from the 20th century would really be able to talk about that slow consolidation of American publishing.
Somebody else asked about wood blocks in Kelly's collection that are not type, like wood cuts or things like that. Are there things like that in the collection?
There are. There's both rules and borders and decorative material that he did very little work identifying, mostly because it's really hard to do. I've done my best to show all of that material in the book and sort of get close to dating them, but a lot of that we're left with using the specimen catalog record to see when someone was selling that material, and they were not as emphatic about selling typefaces, or they were not as emphatic about selling decorative material as they were about selling faces. So it's hard to sort of write that. But we do, the collection has a range of sort of engraved wood blocks that would have been used, sort of standardized sort of forms that you could buy from the type manufacturer. The biggest part of that collection is actually at the Carey. He held on to a lot of that just because it's gorgeous material, and he kept that for his own collection after he sold the bulk of the collection in '66. He kept that with him, and that's now mostly at the Carey collection.
So for our last question, it's sort of a combination of something that I have been thinking about and then something that somebody else asked. As I said in the introduction, one of the things I find fascinating about the book and your work is that it really kind of reframes or recenters the history of printing in America. And I think a lot of times when people think about wood type, it's because it's posters and it's fun and it's weird that it sort of feels down market, right? That it's not serious printing. And I think, so, when you're talking about the future, but somebody's question is, what do the next 50 years of these study collections look like? But I just kind of wanted you to expand on kind of the future of thinking about how wood type fits into the history of printing in 19th and 20th century America.
Yeah, somebody should do that work. That would be great. I think you're right about it being seen. It was sort of disparaged, right? It was sort of common, commercial. It was the internet of the 19th century, and sort of mostly kind of looked down upon by big parts of the culture as being kind of crass and commercial. And certainly the historicizing aspect, you don't historicize crass commercial things in general. I think it really shows the audacity of Kelly's work in sort of carving out a history for this particular aspect of American visual culture. It was really not, it was basically not of interest. It was starting to sort of come back as a countercultural form in the early 60s, but I think in a lot of ways, Kelly was tapping into maybe that zeitgeist, but also kind of leading the charge by producing this material and kind of showing its broad breadth. But in general, it wasn't fine book printing, and so it didn't make it into the history until Kelly sort of brought it into the history. And so because of that gap, there's a lot of things that are missing. But I think it's key to understanding why commercial culture looked the way it did in America in the 19th century and even into the 20th century. And it was mostly because of this. And so I think there needs to be a lot more work done. And hopefully, I think that what I'm doing is just cataloging a lot of stuff so smart people can sort of come after me and do the real work of kind of digital and amalgamative scholarship of figuring out real connections between this. But what I find is it's difficult to make those connections because that information is so broadly dispersed. And so trying to bring it together in one place, other folks can do the heavy work. So did that answer that?
Well, with that, yeah. I know we are out of time. I know we didn't get to everybody's questions. So if you are here and had a question, please do come and chat. And if you're online, please do get in touch with
Can I
David.
share one more thing?
Yeah.
It's super quick. So one of the things that, besides Kelly kind of not dispelling a lot of things that bolstered his reputation, the counter argument to his reputation was he was a real jerk. Right? Like this is the running story. Kelly was a jerk. He kept getting fired from these institutions that he was brought into, and he just a curmudgeon, moved on, blah, 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 blah. And, I didn't know any different, and I sort of believed that. But an interesting little story that I found, a set of photos held at the Carey in Rochester, documenting a particular incident that happened. So he started the program in Minnesota. He was let go from that program because they wanted to consolidate, and they were having financial troubles. Stop me if you've heard this one, and sort of bring things together. And he couldn't really abide by that, and left to Kansas City. In Kansas City, he starts another program. He's the first American to bring Swiss designers in, teaching inside programs, sort of groundbreaking kind of activity, but also the school decides that, declining enrollments, what we're going to have to do is we're going to put industrial design together with graphic design. Kelly wouldn't stand for that and sort of made a big fuss, so they let him go. But what this documentation shows us is, in fact, he wasn't so crusty a curmudgeon, kind of only involved in himself. He really cared about his students, and he was really very interested in education. And so the students, here is Mr. Lotties, who is the president of KCAI, who decided to do this consolidation. And here is an unidentified graphic design student. And there is a chocolate cream pie that she gave to the president of the institution that she was studying at because of the way they screwed over Kelly. And so the man on the left is not smiling. He is not pleased. It may be the hairdo, I don't know. But it sort of opened up this moment for me that showed like Kelly was actually a different person than is portrayed. Like he was a white dude in the middle part of the 20th century. So what was he going to do? But I think in fact there's a whole other layer that I've sort of bumped into him as a really like crispy, crunchy, curmudgeon-y on the outside, but soft and gooey on the inside, really cared about his students, really cared about education, really cared about the programs that he was developing. So I just wanted to share that chocolate cream pie with you. So.